Good evening and welcome to Johnson County Library's Pathway to Publication with Michael Kleber-Diggs. I am Helen Hokinson, one of the planners of our writing programs, and we are very excited to have Michael with us today. Michael Kleber-Diggs is a poet, essayist, and literary critic. His debut poetry collection, Worldly Things, won the Max Ritvo Poetry Prize and will be published by Milkweed Editions in June, or it was published in June, pardon me. Among other places, Michael's writing has appeared or is forthcoming in Great River Review, Waterstone Review, Poem a Day, Poetry Daily, Poetry Northwest, Potomac Review, Hunger Mountain, Memorious, and a few anthologies. So just a few publications under his belt. Michael is a past fellow with the Givens Foundation for African American Literature, a past winner of the Loft Mentor Series in Poetry, and the former Poet Laureate of Anoka County Libraries. His work has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize and the Best of the Net and has been supported by the Minnesota State Arts Board and the Jerome Foundation. Michael is married to Karen Kleber-Diggs, a tropical horticulturist and orchid specialist. Karen and Michael have a daughter who is pursuing a BFA in dance performance at SUNY Purchase. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Michael.
Thanks very much, Helen, and thanks everyone for being here. It's an honor for me to share some more time with you tonight. I really enjoyed a conversation last night with Hadara Barnadav, and I don't know if that is available later on library programs, but if you didn't get to see that, you really should, because Hadara is amazing. I'll also be here Saturday morning leading a workshop on the personal essay, and I'm excited about that as well. Tonight, I wanted to just spend some time talking about my path to publication and then also the path to publication. My hope is that as I'm talking through different ideas, if you have questions, you'll put those in the Q&A section and we can have kind of an interactive conversation. But either way, I'll make sure to save space at the end for questions and to talk a little bit more about publication. So without further ado, before I get to the slide, I just want to start my story with a conversation I had 5 years ago with a writer I admire a great deal named Mark Elling. And Mark has his graduate degree from, I want to say, the University of Alabama. He has an MFA from either Alabama or Mississippi, but one of the schools in the South. And he's a very talented writer. And he's also a person who just has his own vision for how he wants to promote his work in the world. And part of that is just something I admire a great deal. So in 2015, my friend Mark released a book. I don't know if you can see the title or not, but it's called River Dead of Minneapolis, Scavengered by Teenagers. There we go. And it's self-published. He worked with a book-making company called New Carriage to make this book. And I got a copy, and I loved it. And I sat down with Mark to tell him how much I loved his book. And as part of that conversation, one of the things I asked him is, why did you self-publish it? I really felt like he could have found a publisher to work on this book project with him. And I wondered why he didn't do that. And his answer really stuck with me for many years. It really shaped a lot of my vision about writing and a lot about how I think about audience, which is something that's going to come up quite a bit tonight. But he said that his goal with his work is to affect people right where he is. He's more interested in deeper engagement with fewer people than with broader engagement, with narrower engagement with a wider community of people. And I found that fascinating. And Mark does a lot of projects, like he has a mail club that you can subscribe to, and he'll send you really cute, really cool writing things in the mail. And I'm a member of that, and I enjoy it a lot. So he has a way that he promotes his writing and creativity that's really kind of direct to the reader. And I admire that a lot. Mark is going to come up in my remarks tonight because as I was thinking about a book, his ideas really affected me a lot and they shaped a lot of my thinking. I'll talk to you a little bit about my path to publication, and I'll use the PowerPoint to kind of guide that conversation. Um, but here are my thoughts. As you're thinking about publication, I think it's helpful to ask yourself why. Like, why do you want to publish a book? And what is it about that project that really calls to you? Is it that you love writing, that you've completed something that you've written and you just want to see it in print? Um, is it something that you're planning to do as part of your career? Is it something that you hope will be a profession for you? All of these answers will shape, I think, a lot of how you should think about publication. For me, working on a manuscript, working on a book was the next step in my progression as a writer. I just felt like it was the next thing for me to learn and gather experience in. Um, I write two, I primarily write poems and essays, and my book that I'll talk about tonight is a poetry book. And what I've learned as a result of that, I think, informs publishing with respect to fiction projects, nonfiction projects, and anything else that you're seeking to kind of publish. The poetry world works a little bit differently, and I'll talk about that too. But I'd been working on poems for a number of years. I'd been publishing into individual poems here and there. Um, I started to feel like I had a sense for my voice in poetry. And I got to the point where I just thought, the next opportunity for me to learn and grow and develop would be to work on a book project. But that why statement is really important, and it can help you stay motivated while you're working on your project. It also can guide the goals that you set for your project, which is where I'm going next. So it's also helpful to identify your goals, what it is you hope to accomplish by writing and publishing a book. Um, Again, are you interested in writing as a career? Are you interested in an artifact? Are you interested in um, adding a capstone to a project that you've been working on for a while? Do you hope to um, develop an audience, be a bestseller? What are your goals for the project? For me, I had 5 goals um, for my poetry book. The first is that I wanted to have a physical object. And that sounds a little bit obvious. Anybody who's thinking about getting a book published or made, obviously, at some point is interested in having that physical object at the end of the process that you can hold on to and have. And for me, that just kind of seemed important. I feel a little bit shy about sharing it, but I want to just be candid. I think a part of it was a little bit connected to midlife crisis level stuff, awareness of my mortality, leading to a desire to have something that would be here past my time on Earth. Uh, I think there was some element of that was kind of creeping into my thinking as I was working on a book. I wanted to work with a publisher I admired and people I enjoyed working with. That was important to me. And that statement also suggests that I wanted to work with a publisher. I wasn't thinking about self publishing, although I'll come back to that in a second. Um, I wanted to work with an editor who would interrogate my manuscript toward its improvement. I wanted to have copy editing and book editing. I wanted to have people kind of making suggestions that would help make the book better. As we shared last night, one of my editors on Worldly Things was Hadara Barnadov, who's a professor at UMKC. Her comments, her notes, her suggestions made the book better and made me a better poet. And that was one of the things that I hoped to do as a result of my process. I wanted to learn about how manuscripts become books. and how books are marketed and sold, and really everything that goes into the project of completing a book. All of those things were important to me. And mainly because as I was doing that and doing all those things and thinking about all those things, I was also hoping that my first book would not be my last book, and that what I learned from my first book would guide my efforts in a second book. That was important to me. And then at the end of all of that, I wanted to have a product that everyone who was involved with the project would feel proud of. Um, and that the team at the publisher would be proud of it, that I would, that the art department, the marketing department, the editors, the publisher itself, everybody would feel good about the work that was done and the book that resulted from that process. So I'm just looking for one thing that I'm going to bring up later. All right, so I found that. There are also within all of your goals unstated things that kind of influence what you hope to do with the publishing process. So, what's missing from your goal statement is also important. Here are things that I chose not to include in my goal statement. I didn't include specific publishers that I wanted to work with. In the poetry world, Grey Wolf, Copper Canyon, Milkweed, BOA, Alice James, Norton, Knopf, Ferris Strauss. There are a list of kind of 10 to 15 publishers that everyone wants to have their book with. That did not factor into my thinking for this first book. I won't pretend like I don't hope to someday continue to grow, and you know, I'm working with Milkweed, which is, if someone told me every book I wrote would be published with Milkweed, I'd be thrilled. They're a great publisher, and they do amazing work, and they far exceeded my dreams when they called me to say that they wanted to work on the book. I was not thinking about awards at all. I was not thinking about money or financial considerations, sales, units sold, anything along those lines. For this first book, I just wanted to learn and grow and develop and have a physical artifact that I would be proud of and the team I worked on it with would be proud of. And that was it. I was thinking about my book as an introduction to me as a poet and as the beginning of my journey as a writer, and not as the destination. And that's something else that I think can matter a lot. There are a lot of poets I admire a great deal, a lot of prominent American poets whose first book was with a relatively small, not necessarily widely known regional press. And through that book, they gained a little bit of an audience, a little bit of attention, a little bit of acclaim. And then for their second book and third book, started to work with more widely known national publishers with a distribution network and internal resources to support marketing and sales and distribution of the book. So I was just really focused on my where I was starting, understanding that it would be part of a process and hoping that it would be one that could develop over time and didn't necessarily have to begin at the very top. Just for fun, I wanted to read or share Octavia Butler's goals. Octavia Butler, the science fiction writer, was a very famous list maker. And if you can find her lists kind of online, they kind of include a lot of things. Some of them are a little catty, but she just is like, this is what I'm going to do. She's a person who would set her intentions and be not at all shy about naming those intentions, and in a way kind of driving toward her destiny by naming her desires. So here's the back of one of her notebooks. There's a really wonderful kind of blog article about it. But she wrote down her goals, and I thought it would be fun to kind of spend a second with those. I shall be a best-selling writer. After Imago, each of my books will be on the bestseller lists of Los Angeles Times, New York Times, Publishers Weekly, Washington Post, etc. My novels will go on to the above list, whether publishers push them or not, whether I'm paid a high advance or not, whether I ever win another award or not. This is my life. I write best selling novels. My novels go onto the bestseller lists on or shortly after publication. My novels each travel up to the top of the bestseller list, and they reach the top and they stay on top for months, at least two. Each of my novels does this. So be it. So be it. I will find a way to do this. So be it. So be it. See to it. My books will be read by millions of people. I will buy a beautiful home in an excellent neighborhood. I will send poor Black youngsters to Clarion for writing workshops. I will help poor Black youngsters broaden their horizons. I will help poor Black youngsters go to college. I will get the best of health care for my mother and myself. I will hire a car whenever I want or need to. I will travel wherever and whenever in the world I want to. My books will be read by millions of people. So be it. See to it. So there's power in expressing your goals and writing them down and setting your intentions and being very clear and bold in that naming. So my book was published in June, as Helen shared, and I just wanted to take a moment to share. Here's what I've learned so far. My book was published by Milkweed Editions, and as I shared, they are a highly regarded independent publisher. They have a national reach. They have relationships with reviewers, booksellers, journalists, uh, distribution channels. They printed an advanced reader copy of the book and sent it to over 100 people requesting reviews. Through their efforts, I received notice in exalted places like the New York Times. They have been very supportive of my book and stood behind it 100% and helped exceed all of my expectations. I had three editors offer guidance on my manuscript. One was the contest judge who selected the book, a poet of international renown named Henri Cole. He sent notes, not very many, 6 or 7 ideas. A couple were take this poem out, which I kind of thought, all right, all right. But most of them were just like suggestions on some of the poems. I had an editor at Milkweed send me comments, and then they hired Hadara to review the manuscript as well. And I cannot stress this enough. That editorial feedback took a book that I felt was good and made it better. I also learned a lot by looking at the comments that they were making and thinking about my tendencies as a writer, my growth opportunities as a writer, and trying to get better as a result of that. So, that outside guidance, that outside counsel, an extra set of eyes, those things can matter a lot to the work you're making and to you as a writer. On my book, everything was scheduled down to the day from the very beginning. The first communication that I got from the editor who was assigned to my book told me, here are the 10 dates on which things will happen. And they did not deviate from that by one day. And that schedule, that attentiveness to the production schedule, all of those things were helpful for me and beneficial. The editor who I worked with, her name is Lee Oglesby, and she's since gone on to Flatiron Books out in New York. She was functioning as kind of a project manager. So she was making sure the art department was on time, that the copy editors and other editors were done with their portion of it, that the cover was designed and completed, that advanced reader copies were available and sent out, that we reviewed those for edits, that the audio book was recorded and set up, and all of those, every detail associated with getting the book, helping the book meet its publication date and be ready by its publication date was presided over by an editor who was working as a production manager. The reason I bring that up is because if what you're thinking, one of the things you're thinking about is self publication, it's really helpful to kind of understand how significant that work effort is if what you have in mind is a successful book project. Um, you can do all of those things on your own. There are a lot of publishing vehicles that you can hire where they will assign a project manager, a art designer, copy editors, and all those things. And of course, that comes at a pretty significant expense. But as you're thinking about publication, one of the things that can distinguish self publication from traditional publication is that it is a really big work effort. To produce a successful book takes a lot of time and effort. In my process, I had interaction with book editors, with marketing, and with the art department. I was also assigned a publicist, someone who helps me connect to opportunities for conversations about that book, about the book, to ask me if I'm interested in reading in particular places or being part of conferences. They suggest me if someone reaches out to the press looking for someone to speak with. And since the book was published, I continue to work closely with the marketing department and with my publicist to promote the book. And I've learned a lot as a result of that process as well. Just how books are sold, how they're marketed, how they're reviewed, distributed, those types of things. And then the last note I kind of include because I love to list things that are super obvious, but publishers care about sales. This sounds a little bit silly. I don't necessarily care about that. I mean, I'm a poet, and poetry books typically don't sell a lot of copies. It's a rare poet who, for example, has a best-selling book and buys a lake cabin or something like that. That's the stuff that happens in the world of novels. A successful print run for poetry is 1,000 books. I have a lot of friends who are poets who are widely known, who are talented, who are publishing their fifth or sixth book and have never sold through that first print run. Publishers care about sales. Regardless of what kind of book it is, they are proceeding as though it might find that exact right tipping point and become the next big thing. So, and it's not to say poetry books never sell big. Rupi Kaur has sold a lot of poetry books. Amanda Gorman, whose book I think came out today or is about to come out, that book is going to sell a lot of copies, a lot of copies. But for me, a Minnesota poet from Kansas, my initial thought was, yeah, all right, if I sell 300 copies, I'll feel great about that. I'd feel absolutely great about that. I have, by the way, sold through my first print run, and I'm well into my second print run, and I feel very lucky for that. And I'll talk about how and why a little bit later. But as a poet, I was not, at the point that I was writing the book, the furthest thing from my mind is how can I write a book that will sell more than 1,000 copies? Nothing changes in my life if I just sell 300 or 1,000. I get royalties on the book, but the difference between the two is not enough to make a significant difference to me one way or the other. I do, of course, love the idea that I'm reaching one more reader. That to me is really important, that the book finds one more reader, that there's a poem in there that speaks to one more person, that through that I'm in some form or fashion able to have conversations about topics and themes that mean a lot to me. But sales was not something I was thinking about or even equipped to promote in the way that a publisher would. All right. I want to just take a quick moment. I'm keeping an eye on time, make sure that we've got plenty of time for dialogue. But I wrote a short essay about designing the book cover. It's called The Blank Page, a cover image story. So if you want to look it up later, just Google my name and The Blank Page, a cover image story, and it'll come up. But Milkweed asked me to write about the process of designing the cover. And this is what I came up with. The last poem I wrote is about a black man in a blue Pontiac Vibe station wagon parked in the park for most of the day every weekday. That poem was inspired by a black man in a blue Pontiac Vibe station wagon parked in the park across the street from my house every weekday. I see him when I take our dogs for a walk. I saw him this morning. By appearances, the man in the station wagon is middle aged, like me. He has a beard with plenty of gray in it, like mine, except his beard curls out longer and thicker. We both wear glasses, and sometimes I wear black glasses with heavy frames that look a lot like his. I have them on now. The poem began with me wondering about the circumstances that led him to the park every day, and ended with me realizing I wanted to talk about what we share in common and don't seem to share in common. 2020 was not without difficulty for me, but most of my days are pleasant. Every morning I walk our two golden doodles for fresh air and a break. By contrast, the man, I'm going to try to get a bigger version of it. Yeah, here we go. By contrast, the man in the Pontiac doesn't seem to be doing well. His vibe wants repairs. It appears to have a lot of his possessions in it. When I started writing poetry, I wrote on Monday nights while my wife watched Ally McBeal. Whether I had an idea or not, on Monday nights at 8 o'clock, I wrote a poem. I had Ron Padgett's Handbook of Poetic Forms, and I kid you not, if I didn't have an idea for something to write about, I'd look up a form and try it. Here's one thing I learned. It's a good idea to have an idea before you start a sestina, which is a kind of poem that's 39 lines long and has complicated rules. These days, I don't write poems at designated times. I try to walk around open to possibilities. I start after the idea or image arrives, after I wander around with it a bit and find an entry point. For me, the distance between inspiration and entry point often takes a couple of days. Sometimes it's a matter of minutes. Every once in a while, the inspiration is the entry point, but however long it takes, the page isn't blank when I sit down to write. I have a sense for where I want to begin, and hopefully not much sense for where I'll end up. I almost never confront the blank page. Worldly Things is my first book. Associated with its publication, I am learning how manuscripts become books. I understood most of it on a theoretical level, and I'm seeing it as a practical matter now. Step by step, the steps the authors can see. I understood theoretically that my book would have a cover and someone would design it. I suspected I'd have some input in that process. This information might have compelled me to be ready for someone to seek my input. It sure might have. Mary Austin Speaker, the accomplished poet and talented cover artist who designed the cover for Worldly Things, sent me an email asking for my thoughts on the cover and explaining her preferred process. Just like that, I found myself confronting the blank page. Monday night, 8 o'clock, write a villanelle, write it now, white space, static, no images, no ideas, too many images, too many ideas. So this is just me saying, I got a note from the art department asking, what do you want on the cover? And that began a series of, oh my God, how have I not thought of this until now? But the art director at Milkweed, Mary Austin Speaker, sent me a lot of ideas for what writers think about. She asked me what themes and images kind of resonate for me related to the book. I went through this tortured back and forth with her that I'd love to see anthologized sometime. And then I asked her about using art and reached out to an artist in Minneapolis named Wing Young Huey, whose photo makes up the cover of the book. But designing the cover, in theory, is something I could have done on my own, but I'm really grateful that I had the benefit of a trained professional to kind of guide me through that process. Someone who really understands what's successful and what's effective and could help me frame my thinking with respect to something like the cover. Okay, so tonight I want to talk a little bit about traditional publishing versus self-publishing. And I want to say, I mean, there's a lot of great things about traditional publishing. They have the existing relationships and they can leverage them on your behalf. And those relationships can make a big difference to the success of your book, however you define that. Is it how many people have access to it? Is it sales? Is it money? Is it awards? Is it geographic reach? All those things make are easier in traditional publishing. There's no question about that. Um, if you've got a publisher who has the means to do it, their ability to promote your book is going to be easier, not necessarily better, but easier than your ability to do it on your own. But there are some challenges. It can take a long time. If I finished a poetry book right now and sent it to Milkweed and they said yes, they would love to publish it, I think it would come out in 2024, just to give you a ballpark for that. Um, and it's kind of the same if I send them a book of essays. It takes time. Nothing happens overnight, that's for sure. You hear no a lot. That's just kind of part of the process. And his really amazing book on writing, Stephen King talks about his growth as a writer, getting that first book sold, finally getting someone to buy Carrie, and how that changed his life, but how many times he heard no before that. In that book, he says that he had a nail that he put in the wall of his writing studio. And when he would get a rejection letter, he would put it on the nail. And then he filled that one up and added a second nail and started to fill that one up as well. You hear no a lot. And that no very often doesn't have anything to do with your book. It just has to do with what they have in queue, what they're marketing right now, what they're finding to be successful right now, how they promote books, and what they're most effective at promoting. Sometimes it's about the work, but often it's kind of about the publishing house and their specific interests. Traditional publishing can be expensive. I'm mainly talking about poets here. First books in poetry are published as a result of contests. So you send your manuscript to a contest along with somewhere between $25 and $50 as an entry fee. And it's not unusual for poets to spend hundreds of dollars before they get a yes on a book that will not sell that much in royalties. Um, it's not about money in poetry. In novels and in nonfiction, you have to navigate gatekeepers. Every writer does. If you're working with traditional publishers, you have to find an agent, you have to get an editor, and you have to get an editor to get a publisher to say yes. And navigating that process is challenging and time consuming and difficult and despairing. But when it starts to work out, when you get an agent pushing a manuscript on your behalf, things really start to get a lot easier. Publishing is also biased, and that can be a factor in it too. The first bias is towards sales and marketing, which kind of dictates a lot. If you have a masterful, amazing, well-written, transformative work that's 1,000 pages long, a lot of publishers won't even, they're like, nope, can't sell it, can't find a shelf for it, don't want to get involved in it. So their bias is heavily toward what can we sell? What can we market, promote, and sell? And that bias is not universal. There are definitely publishers who focus on like work of high literary value. There are publishers who do both, who focus on sales so that they can also promote work of outstanding merit. But that bias is part of it. And it skews the industry toward a kind of conservatism. As a general rule, not a universal rule, a rule with zillions of exceptions, but as a general rule, things that they can easily imagine a home for are more likely to find a yes than things that take work for them to approve. That's just kind of how it is. Publishing is also biased racially, ethnically, culturally, by gender, by sexuality and sexual orientation, by religion, and so many other ways. So, getting work that's outside of, kind of the traditional view published can be trickier. There's a gravitation toward narratives that feature white characters, and then work that has cultural connections they really want it to be very culturally connected, and they want those cultural connections to be in a way that they understand. I won't go too far into this, but I just wanted to show you some data from 2019, just kind of a snapshot. The publishing world is mostly white. It's mostly women, which makes it unlike a lot of industries in America. It's overwhelmingly straight, and it overwhelmingly skews toward people who are not disabled. And there are a lot of works that are getting published that are not written by white women, straight white women who are not disabled. But there's a real there's that bias kind of gets reflected in what gets selected. Oh, okay. So, Anna, I see your question, and I'll get to kind of query letters and summaries and other things in as part of my conversation. So I'll keep an eye on that. Okay. So now let's talk about self-publishing a little bit. Here's a trivia question. Based on sales, what is the most successful self-published book of all time? I can't see the chat. So if you have a guess, put it in the Q&A section. All right. I'll just tell you. Here's the answer. 50 Shades of Grey. 50 Shades of Grey started as fan fiction and built kind of an audience and following based on that, and then became a book that was published, and then a trilogy, and then movies, and a whole kind of cottage industry on its own. But the biggest selling quote unquote self-published book of all time is 50 Shades of Grey. Here are some other self-publishing success stories. Still Alice by Lisa Genova, which became a movie. Switched by Amanda Hawkins. No Thanks by the poet E.E. Cummings. The Martian by Andy Weir. I was downstairs watching television before I came up to visit with all of you, and I saw a tiny commercial for another Andy Weir project that is being sold one chapter at a time on Audible. So I'll talk about that in a second. A Naked Singularity by Sergio de la Pava. Double Persephone by Margaret Atwood, who went on to write The Handmaid's Tale, and Aragon by Christopher Paolini. So there are some self-publishing success stories. I want to tell you just quickly, there's a note about each one that's kind of instructive. The first is that Lisa Genova is a trained neuroscientist, and she sold books out of the trunk of her car for 2 years. And she connected very deeply with the Alzheimer's community and promoted her book as a resource for family members who were dealing with loved ones who had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And over the course of years, built a following an audience that got Simon & Schuster interested in her project. This was not an overnight success. Very few of these books are. Amanda Hawkins was rejected by publishers many times. She self-published and then benefited from a favorable New York Times review before being picked up by Macmillan. Now, that sentence, benefited from a favorable New York Times review, there's a lot in that. Like, I don't know how that happened. If you send your self-published book to the New York Times, the chances that they'll review it, I think, are very small. I wonder a little bit if there was a connection there or some kind of relationship that allowed that book to kind of get selected out of the slush pile for a review. E.E. Cummings is a genius. He went on to transform the world of poetry, and his mother helped him self-publish No Thanks. In other words, she financed that project. Andy Weir, who wrote The Martian that went on to become a movie, built an audience online first. He sold it. It was initially a blog. Then he sold a chapter at a time on Amazon for 99 cents. And over a period of years, that project took off. It became a book. It became a movie. And then it went on from there. As I already shared, E.L. James wrote Twilight fan fiction. Sergio de la Pava is an attorney in New York. He was working as a public defender, and it wrote a long, amazing book about his experience as a public defender, but it was 700 pages long, and publishers weren't interested in it. And his wife took it over, and They've self-published it, and she sent it to reviewers over and over and over until someone decided to look at it. And then it built from there. Margaret Atwood is also a genius, and Doubles Persephone, which was a poetry book, that's, I think, something like 7 poems, won a significant award and then started to gather notice after that. And then Christopher Paolini was a homeschool superstar, and he spent 3 years editing Aragon after he wrote it. He had a lot of family resources to print a lot of copies of that book, and he also had the ability to spend his days taking it to libraries and schools and elsewhere, and over the course of years built an audience that eventually led it to be picked up by a publisher. So self-publishing can be great. Long odds, if your goal is sales, long odds to get there. It almost always ends with a relationship with a publisher and the ability to leverage their print and distribution channels to get sales from out of your car and into bookstores everywhere. Thoughts on self-publishing. So if you're thinking about this at all, first ask yourself, how does it align with your goals? Think about what your goals are for your book. Remember, I said editorial feedback is important to me. You could also get that in self-publishing if you pay for that or if you build it yourself. One of my favorite books of all time, River Dead of Minneapolis, Scavengered by Teenagers, is self-published. So it can also just be about the beautiful thing. I think there maybe are 300 copies of this book in the world, and that's what Mark was trying to do. The quality of the book, it's extremely well made, as a book, as a physical object, is impeccable. And because he was not trying to figure out how to write a bestseller, he was able to devote his energy to making something that meant a lot to him and has gone on to mean a lot to people who read it, like me. It's helpful to know what you're good at. Why would self-publishing work for you? Are you really good at cover design and editing and marketing and promoting and, the kind of hustle that it takes to get your book out into the world? Or are there things that you would need in order for your project to be successful, like editing, cover design, connections, relationship, and audience, time to send it out, money to print it, and do all the things that are needed? So think about all those things as you think about self-publishing. Note on editing. I'm a big proponent of editing. It's an essential element of the writing practice. Every writer published by a traditional publishing house has an editor, period. Toni Morrison had an editor. F. Scott Fitzgerald and so many other famous writers worked with Maxwell Perkins. Those relationships are critical. It's a rare person who can write a book, edit it on their own, revise it on their own, and not need an extra set of eyes to kind of point out inconsistencies or errors or opportunities. It's just a really rare person who can do that. Most writers have beta readers or are part of a writing group. I'm part of a poetry group and a nonfiction group. We get together once a month. We share writing. We share feedback with each other. I've never once gone to one of those sessions and not come out with a better sense of where I can take my work. Ada Limon, who is a poet I admire a great deal, profoundly accomplished, the type of person who I would think could write books on her own, is someone who works as part of a writing group as well. Self-editing, the revision that you do, is also a critical part of the process, and I don't want to undervalue that. But after that's done, there's still benefit in having an extra set of eyes share feedback on your work. So, Anna, I want to talk a little bit about the question that you posed on this slide. So for poets, you write your book, you write poems, you get those published, you kind of get some momentum, some publications, then you build a collection, and then you enter contests. That's the main way it gets done for that first book. A lot of times for the second book too. For novelists and people who write nonfiction, memoir, autobiography, biography, creative nonfiction, essay collections, it can be helpful to start with an agent. And to get an agent to work with you, you often need a query letter and sample chapters. The elements of a query letter are widely available online, so I won't get into a lot of detail on that. But you definitely want to follow the template. You want to be very professional in that part of the process. And you want to send along chapter summaries that are really tight and demonstrate your skill as a writer, and get people excited about the work that you're doing. Here's one note that's worth passing on. In that process, there's also an emphasis on marketing. How will this book be marketed? And one of the things that you will have to provide in your query letter is what genre is this book and what audience is this book for? Genre tends to mean, is it romance? Is it science fiction? Is it literature? Is it a Western? Is it a thriller? What category does this book fall into? Audience tends to be about age, tends to be. Is this a picture book, a chapter book, young adult? Is it adult? Um, what's the audience for this book? And one tip that I've heard in conversation with agents over and over and over is, of course, there are books that fall into multiple categories. But instead of trying to be aspirational when you're naming your gender and when you're naming your audience, your genre, sorry, and your audience, you should be realistic. So the reality is, I'll use young adult novels as an example. Most of the readers for young adult novels, believe it or not, are adults. But you cannot write a young adult novel for adults and call it a young adult novel. You have to write a young adult novel for young adults and hope that it becomes a crossover. And in that letter, you can say a young adult novel, audience is young adult, book has crossover potential. But when you start to get a sense for where your project is going to go, if you're writing a novel or working on a nonfiction project, and you want to partner with an agent to promote it to publishers, and if you're working on a novel, you should work with an agent if you're trying to get to traditional publishers. When you get a sense for your vision for that project, when you have some sample chapters completed and polished, that's a great time to start to look for agents. And the best way to find an agent, frankly, is to look at books that you love, find out who wrote them, and then find out who their agents are. So if you have a Gone Girl type book, find out who Gillian Flynn's agent is and try to reach out to that person. The process for hiring an agent can take time. I've been told by friends who have agents that who your agent is matters less than how hard they work on your behalf. There are some, of course, very established, very prominent agents who can kind of make sure your book gets a thorough read and a thoughtful read. But for the most part, if you've got a good agent working in the genre that you're leaning toward, they're gonna get it in front of the right places. Hannah, I'm looking at your question. When submitting to chapbook contests, what should the ratio of unpublished poems and poems that have been previously published be? Half, less, or more? In my experience, that you don't want to go too far above half. I think for most chapbook publishers and most poetry publishers, they're really going to be focused on the quality of the work. I'm reading for a poetry prize right now, and I'm a first round reader, but I don't care at all how many of those poems have been published, and where. Don't care at all. I mainly am just looking at the poems, looking at the manuscripts, and looking at the quality of the work. That said, I think for publishers in general, if every poem has been published, they may feel like they're not necessarily adding a lot. Chapbook publishers tend to be pretty generous and supportive and open. But I would caution against going too far above half of those being published, if possible. It's always going to be the quality of work that determines what happens with that project. But if at the time that you submit it, they see that every poem has already been placed, that might affect their interest in publishing it. I think most of the decisions are made by first round readers and judges. And as a general rule, I'm going to assume first round readers and judges do not care. I don't care. I would never open a book that I've been asked to evaluate on behalf of a contest and say, too many of these have been published. That would never come up in how I reviewed the book. And if I opened it up and saw that poems have been placed in poetry and the Paris Review and the New Yorker and so on, that would also not affect how I read the manuscript. It just wouldn't. So I think you could, for most of the time, you could be fine, but I would try to stay half or less. Here's my main message. Know what your goals are for anything that you're hoping to publish. Know the avenues that best allow you to achieve those goals. Traditional publishing, self-publishing, know your strengths and know your weaknesses, and include those as part of what you're thinking about with respect to your project. If you're in poetry, I think there's real wisdom in thinking about your first book as a step and not a destination, as part of a progression that you can make in a career of writing. I think in a novel, in nonfiction work, you've got a greater potential on that first book to not have to kind of get yourself going on your way somewhere. If the book is solid, it's going to find a home, and you don't have to fight as hard to get through a contest. You just have to find an agent to stand behind it and a publisher to get excited about it. So with all that lecturing, I'll hold there. And if you have any questions at all, I'd love to share feedback on your questions in the time that we have left.
No, presenter.
So I see the question from Lisa. Thank you, Lisa. So, all right. What if you work in more than one genre and you have projects going in each? Is there a good way to focus or prioritize? So, the worst person to ask that question. Right now, I have 2 projects going, one in poetry and one in creative nonfiction. And I've just kind of decided not to focus on one or the other, to take it as an opportunity to work on one or the other when my interests are kind of in that particular area. On the essay project, I have a publisher who's interested. It's my same publisher, and I've talked to them about it in kind of an overview fashion. And I hope to share a book proposal with them soon. This is where I see the project going. These are the themes and topics that I want to explore. Here's a general outline that I see for the book. Once I do that, then it becomes a project, and that will become my focus. Poetry is kind of just a consistent day-to-day practice for me. And at some point I'll get, a group of poems together and start thinking about the possibility of preparing a manuscript based on whether and how they're in conversation with each other. So I want to hopefully answer, like, what if you don't focus? Like, what if you just do both? I mean, focus feels like something that you do when you're thinking about time to market. Like, I need to focus on one of these so I can get it published sooner and get it up and running and that kind of a thing. And it's not that I want to talk you out of that, but I'm kind of a big fan of it's a marathon, not a sprint. And take your time. My first book came out when I was 53, so I'm probably not the best person to ask, but I would say try not to focus on one or the other. Try to go where your interest and enthusiasm is on a given day. And when you get to the point where those are done, then start to think about possibilities for them. But don't decide until you have to. Oh, I can't hear you.
because I muted myself. We just have about 5 minutes left, 4 minutes now. If any last questions, now's the time. I wonder if while we're waiting to see if any other questions come in, you could talk a little. Can you tell us what your next project is?
Yeah. So I'm working kind of on two things at the same time. I've begun to work on an essay collection about my father's death, which is just a topic that comes up for me all the time. And I'm more interested in the nature of memory and in the nature of grief than I am in the specifics of his death. Although I don't know a lot about the specifics of his death, and I have thought many times that it would be worthwhile to come to Kansas City and look through the criminal records and see if there's anything in there that I might write about. I do know this is for people who were not with us last night. My father, I was born in Kansas City and grew up in Kansas, and my father was a dentist. Our house was in Kansas, but his practice was in Missouri, and my father was a crime victim, and he was killed at his dentist's office when I was 8. And in like preliminary searches, I've learned the name of the man who killed my father. I have his date of birth and other information that would help me kind of get access to that criminal file. And I've thought about that as part of the research. But I want to write about my father's death, about the nature of memory, about the nature of grief, and I also want to continue to write poems. You mentioned a couple of great books about writing and poetry. I'm curious what you read for inspiration. Do you stray from the genres you work in, return to favorites like Sharon Olds and Denise Smith? Any craft books you return to again and again? Oh, that's such a great question. So first of all, I read widely. The only thing, like if my wife were in the room with me right now, she would say, I kind of gravitate toward literary books. So except that in the summer, I love to read crime books. So I have a great affection for the Norwegian crime writer Joe Nesbo. And I also really love the Irish crime writer Tana French. So in the summer, I can read kind of, I love crime books and those types of things, but I read a lot of fiction. I probably my two favorite books this year were Harlem Shuffle by Colson Whitehead, and I really loved Clara and the Sun by the Nobel Prize winning. Anyway, I really loved those two books, and that's how I stay. I stay inspired by reading. I also love music, and music inspires me a lot. Craft books are also a huge part of what I do, and I love On Writing by Stephen King, and I also love this book called A Poet's Craft by Annie Finch, which is it's more of a diagnostic tool probably than anything else, but it really gets into the specifics of how poems are made in a way that I really benefit from and teach from a lot and learn from a lot. Thanks for that question.
That is a great question. So we are at the end of our time. I want to remind everyone that Michael is teaching a workshop on Saturday morning from 9 to 11. So it's not too early. You don't have to be like a hardcore morning person. It is online. You can find it through the library's website. And we hope to see you there. It's going to be on the art of the personal essay. And then just so you know, in February, we'll be having Amy Nescahumataro, and in March, BJ Hollers. And so we hope you'll check back on the website for those dates and you'll come to those. And with that, I will say goodnight, Michael. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Fabulous talk.
It was a pleasure.
Yes, thank you.